On today's show, Ben Ladner returns to the podcast to talk about the upcoming season, from the Hawks to their keys of the season, the way the East might shape up, and more. All of that is on the way.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1553 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Friday here in late September. And today's show is brought to you by Jase Medical. Empower yourself when you purchase a Jase case, providing you with a personal supply of 5 antibiotics that treat 50+ infections. Get yours today at jasemedical.com. That is JASE medical.com. I also want to tell you at the top of the podcast to make us your first listen each and every day, and check us out and subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts, places like Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, etc. And today's show is actually part 1 of 2 with my friend Ben Ladner. Ben's been on this podcast many times. He is one of the hosts of the Read and React podcast, is a writer in the basketball space. Used to cover the Hawks full time, now more of a broad NBA focus for Ben, but always a favorite time to talk to him. I should plug up the top of the podcast as well. I have 2 installments earlier this week with Robbie Callan in our Over Under series. More of that to come later on this month and into October, but fun had by all today. Again, part 1 of 2 with Ben Ladner. Without any further delay, here is myself and Ben. I'm joined once again by friend of the podcast, Ben Ladner. Ben, welcome back to the show.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's been a while. We're almost there. It's kind of occurring to me. I don't know if you're having this feeling as an NBA consumer. It's like we're almost there. Like the Dame stuff started again this week, and it's like, okay, I guess people trying to get their business done before training camp. The Hawks don't have so much drama, but it's a good time to sort of do a little bit of a catch up here. And, I said this before, you brought you in, like, you don't cover the Hawks every day anymore, but you cover the NBA and pay attention to things. And I actually want to ask you this to start things off. Since it's been a few months since the season ended, I want to know how you felt about the Hawks last year. A very broad question. And then I want to know how that's changed, because they didn't really do a ton this summer. So I want to know kind of where your head is, and then we'll dive in from there.
Well, I think like most people, I felt like the Hawks. I was maybe uninspired by the Hawks last year.
Well, you were whelmed by the Hawks?
Yeah, I was very much whelmed. We talked a lot, both when I came on here and you on Twitter, and I think it was kind of the national sentiment as well about the Hawks, was that they were very average. They were almost strikingly average in their point differential. Their record, 41-41. I think they were 9th in offensive efficiency last year and 21st in defensive efficiency. So they're just kind of equidistant from halfway on both sides of the ball there. And so, it was, and I think watching them, it was a team you kind of felt like, all right, this is a team that is definitely a professional basketball team that like belongs in the NBA and can beat a lot of NBA teams, but could also lose to pretty much any given team on any night. Could kind of go either way. And it's probably not going to make a deep playoff run. And lo and behold, that's kind of what ended up happening. All of the numerical indications and kind of the sense you got watching them turned out to be a pretty accurate representation of what that team was last year. I think this year, I don't know. I think there are some reasons to be more optimistic about Atlanta this year. I think there are maybe some reasons to be concerned, not necessarily about a step back, but just about some stagnation. And I think they're one of these teams, as you look at the Eastern Conference, that you would expect, or at least in their own heads, would be expecting themselves to take a step forward next year. And based on the layout of the East, based on the fact that there are some other teams, I think, who are in that similar range trying to take a step forward, I'm not sure they'll take like a meaningful step forward and be significantly better next year. But I do see some growth potential on either end of the ball. And it'll just kind of be a matter of, the players responsible for like holding up each end of the floor, kind of getting back to the levels we've seen them play at in the past, I think, as well as getting some ancillary players to support that as well. But really, it's kind of those tentpole players like performing at the level that they've shown they're capable of performing at. And I didn't think they did that consistently last year.
Yeah, that consistency framing is one that I've shared quite a bit. And I know Glenn Willis has been on the show many times talking about that same thing. And that's been probably, you could certainly say defense is a bigger issue, but like it kind of goes in that same realm. Like they just have not been consistent. And it's like sort of building that, they've not been bad. Like we just talked about, the symmetry has been well documented. Even after Snyder took over, they were better on offense and worse on defense. And it was like, and granted, they were openly trying things. They were not necessarily, anyway, we can go into that if we want to, but they are banking on that internal growth quite a bit, as we sort of allude to. Like they didn't make big changes. In fact, if anything, they got worse. They trade John Collins for nothing. You have a full season of Sadiq Bey. That definitely helps too, but it's mostly internal growth they're looking for. You mentioned guys performing at the level that they kind of need to perform. I wonder who you're referring to. I have my ideas of guys like who are, that they've banked on and have had in the past. I think I've talked about, Trae didn't have a great year last year. He wasn't bad. He was still very good. In fact, I think he's probably underrated at this point, but he wasn't as good as he was the year before. Is that on your list? And I want to know, who are you thinking of when you say that kind of thing about the guys who have to either bounce back or maybe even improve more than they've been in the past?
I think Trae is definitely one of them. You mentioned not bad last year, but not probably at the level you need your primary offensive guy to be if you're building your team with an offensive identity, which I think the Hawks are.
Yes.
And probably should, based on the fact that they are building around Trae Young. To me, Clint Capella and Dejounte Murray were also two of those guys where you're sort of relying on both of them to be really good defensively, or at least to be as good as the Hawks kind of in the range of defensive efficiency that qualifies as good for the Hawks maybe. And I think Capella, he's getting older, and I thought at times he looked pretty good last year. Like he was still sort of a defensive anchor, and then at other times didn't quite look that way. And then Dejounte Murray, just I think all season on both ends of the floor, they were banking on him as being both kind of an ancillary, or like a secondary defensive piece to Capella, I think, and also kind of a secondary offensive piece to Trae, a guy who could kind of do both of those roles. And I think it just never really looked like it had clicked last year. You would know better than I would, but to my eye, and I think statistically too, it kind of felt like Dejounte Murray was always figuring out where he fit in and how he fit in last year, instead of being able to just kind of lock in. And maybe this is, with a year under their belts, year two now with this core together and him playing with this team, maybe they figure that out a little bit more, and the consistency with having Quinn Snyder for a full season instead of just for, a half season, that could solve some of those issues. But to me, it's those three guys that they're kind of banking on: Trae on offense, Capella on defense, and then Murray supplementing each of those guys on both ends.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've argued, and I would still argue now, their center play is about the only thing that I don't worry about defensively. It's like, I would agree with you. Capella last year wasn't as good as he had been a couple of years before that, but I still think on the whole, he's a very good defensive player. Okongwu is very good too behind him. They have 48 minutes of quality center play, and that's important to your defense. It's the problem. Problem was, I could argue there wasn't a single other positive spot on the floor defensively. DeAndre Hunter is maybe the closest. Collins was pretty good, I think, and still remains very underrated defensively, in my opinion. But those are the kind of guys where, if Collins is your second best defender, and I think he was last year behind the centers anyway, if you want to include Okongwu in there, that's not a great recipe. And Murray, I know I'm repeating myself a little bit from previous episodes, but the theory of the case for Murray never really materialized. And it wasn't even just the external theory. It's the theory of the case that they put forth and that they talked about openly, both on the record, off the record, all those things. The whole theory about Murray was, yeah, we're going to be really good with him and Trae, but we also are bringing him in to boost the team with Trae off the floor. And we're also bringing him in to boost the point of attack defense. And those things did not happen, just flat out did not happen. And you can say that's not entirely his fault, and I would agree with that. It's not all on Murray, but that theory just did not happen. And, I think we could talk about Snyder as much or as little as you want to, but I think a lot of the messaging in the offseason and just by the roster and the lack of changes is basically hey, we think that Quinn's going to make this huge, massive difference to our team, because they still have really high expectations. Like you teased it earlier, they're not going to be okay with playing again. They're just not. And this roster just went to the play-in twice in a row. And it's okay, what's changed? The head coach has changed. And yes, there's guys who've gotten older. It's still a fairly young roster, but you're someone on the outside, but also who watches this stuff closely. Quinn Snyder's really good. And I want to know what you think about this. How much impact can a coach have? It's kind of a broad topic. I mean that intentionally, because I have you on the show to talk about the whole league in some respects, but if I just frame it that way, okay, you're not covering the team every day. This is what the Hawks are kind of messaging. Hey, our big addition is Quinn Snyder. What can that actually do for you as far as season to season? I know there's a little bit of noise in there, obviously. Today's show is brought to you by Jase Medical. Everyone should be empowered to care for themselves and their loved ones during unexpected times. That's why Jase Medical offers the Jase Case. The Jase Case provides 5 life-saving antibiotics for emergency use. It gives you a peace of mind that you're not just hoping that you have access to medication in the case of an emergency. Jase Medical also helps you have your medication in hand, and it's very, very simple. They handle everything from the online evaluation to the licensed pharmacy medication delivery, as well as ongoing consultation and care. With Jase Medical, you will not be caught unprepared, which is something that I know is quite valuable in any situation. As a listener or viewer of this podcast, you can also save more than $360 like these life-saving antibiotics with Jase Medical. Plus, you can get an additional $20 off by using the promo code LOCKEDON at checkout at jasemedical.com. That is $20 extra off by using that promo code LOCKEDON at jasemedical.com. That is JASE medical.com, promo code LOCKEDON, jasemedical.com.
Man, yeah, that's a good question. Number one, I think it depends on which coach he's replacing. So I think in this case, Quinn Snyder can have a pretty significant impact, just because I think the way that he organizes offenses is pretty different from Nate McMillan, who he's succeeding. So I guess technically Joe Prunty maybe is who he's succeeding.
Joe Prunty went 2-0 last season. I'll never let anybody forget that. 2-0 Joe Prunty.
Perpetual interim head coach Joe Prunty, who actually it seems to be a pretty good NBA assistant. I don't mean to rag on Joe Prunty.
He absolutely, I mean, not to go down the road. Yes, everybody, number one, everyone loves Joe Prunty. And number two, like has a very good reputation like as a good coach. And there's a reason why like Quinn was very open, like, hey, I'm leaning on Joe a lot. And it was like, he didn't have to do that. And he actually was. So it was, anyway, Joe Prunty. Pro Joe Prunty podcast.
Same. Yeah. I agree with that. I think Quinn Snyder certainly comes in with a reputation, though, as someone who can organize your offense in just kind of a different way, a more modern way, maybe. So I think in that respect, it can make a pretty significant difference. But it also depends just on how much buy-in he's going to get from the players, how much his players are actually going to commit to executing what he needs them to execute in order to kind of fulfill the vision that he has for the team. So it's sort of in both of those areas. And then, at some point the coach kind of, it's not down to the coach, it's down to the players. So I think, maybe a 10 to 15% difference kind of at the once you have the personnel and the skill and kind of the player side in place, I think the coach can maybe take you from like a 75th percentile team to a 95th percentile team, something like that. Maybe less than that, 75th to 85th, whatever. So I think kind of on that top end, if you already have kind of, I've heard a lot of people make the front office buys the ingredients and the coach cooks the meal or whatever. If you have good ingredients, like you can make a pretty good meal. And then if you don't, it's only going to taste so good. It's only going to turn out so well. So I think like, it can be a noticeable difference and maybe a meaningful one at kind of the top end of the spectrum. But with this team, like we talked about, the Hawks are kind of in the range of team where it's like, are they good enough for what Quinn Snyder does to really like put them over the top? Or are they the kind of team, or is Quinn Snyder the kind of coach that like he's exactly the coach that they need, because they do have all of this low-hanging fruit where they can kind of clean things up, and he's going to come in and not professionalize, but kind of polish things up and sharpen things up, fine-tune the offensive system, and get things clicking at a really high level. I'm not sure which of those two teams the Hawks are and which of those two kinds of coaches Quinn Snyder is.
It's really interesting because, I know there are a lot of like newer Hawks fans from the Trae era, even just younger people, but like, Mike Budenholzer was here, and like, that's maybe the number one go-to recent example of a coach that's like a regular season maven. Like everyone understands like Bud's really good at what he does. And like, he's kind of obviously you have to have the players are more important than the coach. I don't want to be, it's much more important to have good players, but like Bud just kind of, there's a reputation there that's earned. And the two places that he's been of just like building regular season machinery that will work and win games. But Quinn is kind of similar. I mean, he's obviously coached under Bud for a year here, but he won 48. Well, he was at a 48 win pace or better if you throw in the pandemic shortened season. 48 wins or better in 6 straight years in Utah. And like I would argue and have argued that the pieces on that roster were not notably better than the Hawks pieces. Now, you could argue they're better. I'm not going to sit here and have the whole discussion about like, because he had Rudy, and Rudy is a generational rim protector, and I get that. But like, the rest of the roster, Mitchell's really good, but like Trae's similar to Mitchell. Like it's not like they had this incredible like bulletproof roster for 6 straight seasons in Utah, and he was able to kind of keep it on the tracks. And like how much credit he gets for that, I there's not an exact answer for that. I did a lot of digging of people that covered Utah, like, hey, how big of a deal was Quinn and all this? And it's a big deal, but like how big is an interesting question. And I say all that because again, like a lot of the messaging is like he's going to fix everything, and I hesitate to do that, but I also think, and I think you agree. I'm not even sure. I think the Hawks have underachieved the last 2 seasons compared to their roster. So if part of that is coaching, and I think part of it is, Nate got a lot of local heat, and I think that some of that is justified. But like, if the theory is we were underperforming because of our coach, and now we have a notable upgrade there, like I can easily see that selling points, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and the other thing about Snyder, I think, is that he's maybe but I mean, I think he's probably a better maybe under the hood tactician, kind of fine tuning in real time sort of coach than Bud was. But he's similar to Bud, like you mentioned, in that I think he's really good on principles and concepts. And that the thing Utah always had was they just like one thing flowed into the next. Guys kind of knew where to be. Their spacing was really sound. They were always kind of nailing the fundamentals of motion, spread, pick and roll offense, and you just kind of knew that all of those things, those little things that you kind of talk about in drills and in training camp and try to instill in players is just kind of, this is how we play. These are the principles by which we play. You never really had to worry about those things in Utah. I think that those are actually areas where Atlanta has not been great in recent years, and it's just kind of like they have to be running a scripted set, it feels like, or a Trae Young pick and roll where he can just sort of determine it in order for there to look like there's any sort of offensive cohesion. And so I wonder if one of the areas where he kind of sharpens things up is just getting guys to maybe understand how the offense can flow into itself a little bit more consistently, and just maybe look a little bit more smoothly running, instead of the kind of disjointed thing we saw last year where it was like, all right, this Trae Young pick and roll didn't work. Let's give it to Dejounte Murray and maybe he can run a pick and roll. And now let's try DeAndre Hunter on the wing. And okay, no, he couldn't get separation. Let's go back to Trae Young, and it's just kind of like one individual move instead of like a series of actions flowing into each other. The Hawks have never really been that kind of team. And some of that, like I was saying earlier, is down to the players really. And Trae Young specifically, like buying into that and being willing to do that, because that's not really the way he plays. But I think some of those principles we saw in Utah that, we've seen Quinn Snyder really have success doing in recent years, those are things that could really help Atlanta. At the same time, those are also things I think that the whole league has sort of caught up on nowadays. Like almost everyone has great spacing. Almost everyone runs like weak side actions to distract the defense while the primary thing's happening over here. There's so much movement and spacing and all of that baked into modern offense now that, like, if those Utah teams with like Gordon Hayward and Donovan Mitchell, or even like the Ricky Rubio versions, later on, if they'd been playing, I think in the modern era, their offense wouldn't maybe have quite the same advantage from doing those things, because everyone does those things now. Similar to those 2015 Hawks, who I actually was watching those some of those teams last night and kind of doing some like a historical kind of look back at that to remind myself of those 2015 teams. So it's funny you brought that up a second ago, but it was the same kind of idea where like you watch those teams now, and at the time they felt so revolutionary, and now it's sort of like, oh, these are actions that everybody's running, So I think it's harder to create advantages that way than it used to be. But certainly the Hawks are a team that can kind of use what Quinn Snyder brings to the table in those respects.
Today's show is brought to you by Birddogs. Birddogs is fantastic, bringing fit, comfort, and versatility to the table with their products. I feel great and comfortable in my own skin while wearing all my Birddogs gear, and they have all kinds of things that you might enjoy. Plus, their Birddog stretch khaki shorts are designed to fit slimmer through the thigh and leg. You get that swift look that you're actually seeking when you are looking for the clothes that fit and feel great around you. They fit much better than regular shorts that have been made of that stiff, restricting cotton that everybody hates. Birddogs also fixes that issue by inventing a cloud knit fabric that looks just like khaki, but also stretches, give you the slimmer fit without having to sacrifice any of your movement. They also utilize anti-sweat-wicking fabric, keep it cool and dry all day long. Birddogs are functional for any occasion, whether it's a date or playing golf, going out, working out, or just hanging out. In the end, the folks at Birddogs make awesome products, and you're going to want to check them all out in one place. That's birddogs.com/LockedOnNBA. Use the promo code LOCKEDONNBA when you get there at checkout for a free Birddogs water bottle with your order. That is birddogs.com/LOCKEDONNBA for a free water bottle at checkout. You will not want to take your bird dogs off. We promise you. Quinn's impact is, and I walk this line carefully because I said at the time about how weird it was that he took over midseason, and some of the cultural, fundamental things were really impossible for him to bring in February. Like, that just wasn't going to happen. And I don't want people to think I'm going to say that it's a 10-win jump because he had an offseason, but I do think it's going to matter that he had a full offseason and camp to install things that he was not able to install last year, which is part of this. I do want to throw out, because you kind of made a natural segue for me about the spacing everybody has that the Hawks don't always have. Last year, pretty famously, I know people love that I say the word famously a lot, and I just did it again. The Hawks did not take a lot of threes.
You famously say that word.
Correct.
Quite
That's
often.
Correct.
Yeah.
The Hawks didn't take a lot of threes last year. The Hawks took a lot of mid-rangers. They were either number 1 or number 2, along with Phoenix, in a lot of the mid-range categories last year. And I've argued part of that is personnel based. They have guys like Trae, like Dejounte, like DeAndre Hunter, who like to take mid-range shots, independent of who their coach is. But they also had a coach that kind of encouraged that more than most coaches would. And I wonder, again, not to make you get in the weeds too much, cognizant of it's not a team you cover every day. How much impact can a system have on that? Because I've said this is not even a hot take, it's a very mild take. They're going to take more threes. Quinn's openly talked about that. They were already taking a few more last year, but I think with this, again, with the whole summer and the whole camp to kind of push guys back and fundamentals and all that stuff, but your spacing questions are interesting because they have a point guard who works masterfully in space, and the best offense that they've ever run always is Trae surrounded by shooters, and they kind of just got away from that by taking, and some of that's roster based. You trade Kevin Huerter, you trade Danilo Gallinari, and you don't replace those guys with dynamic shooters other than AJ Griffin. Part of that's personnel, but man, it drives me crazy, and I have a feeling it would have driven you crazy too if you watched all 82 games last year.
Yeah, I'm sure it would have. I think it like you said, they are definitely going to take more threes. How much more of a difference can a system make? I think in some ways a significant difference, in some ways not. Some of it is just kind of you create threes in different ways, right? It's not every three is created in the same way. So the way that Trae Young creates threes out of the pick and roll, the number of threes that you get off of that might always kind of be consistent because he's going to make the reads that he's going to make and guys are going to catch the ball and shoot it, But I think where the system can make a difference is two kind of main areas. And if there's a third or fourth that I don't hit on, jump in. But to me, it's transition. And that's an area where Utah always took a lot of threes, especially in the later Snyder years. I remember the 2021 Jazz, where it took 45% of their shots from three, and I don't know, half their shots in transition from three, or something like that. Some absurd proportion of their shot of their transition shots were threes, and of their threes were transition threes. So that's one area, and I think also just the in the flow, swing, one more catch and shoot corner three type of stuff. That's where it shows up too, and a lot of that comes off of movement, motion, scripted actions to get guys like DeAndre Hunter is a guy that comes to mind with this, where instead of getting DeAndre Hunter his shots by isoing him in the mid post and kind of letting him cook up a mid-range jumper, run him off an exit screen for a corner three, something like that. Do more things like that, or bring him off kind of a dribble handoff action where he can kind of step into a clean three, something where he's kind of moving, getting an open look, and then getting a clean shot. And I think Trae Young can do more stuff like that. Dejounte Murray can run more actions like that. AJ Griffin certainly is a guy, if he's going to be in the rotation consistently this year, that he can shoot off the move like that as well. So I think those two areas, transition and then just those flow kind of action-based threes, are where you're really going to see an uptick in things. And then, I wonder if part of last year not shooting as much or as many of those was trying to do less just Trae pick and roll. And I think I don't have the numbers on that. I don't know if the Hawks actually did less Trae pick and roll, but it kind of felt like they were trying to diversify their offense and get the ball to different spots of the floor and sort of create shots in different ways. And I encouraged them to do that. I was in favor of that. Not that they listened to me, but like I was I was in favor of them moving in that direction. But maybe this is a trade-off of that. Maybe when you try to diversify your offense and it's a little clunky, like that's not as smooth and simple as just, oh yeah, hey, Trae Young, run a pick and roll, kick out three. We can do that 55 times a game. So like maybe that's just a trade-off you have to live with. And this year they can get back around to maybe finding a healthier balance between those things. I don't really know. I think that's kind of always the give and take of NBA offense is, especially with these heliocentric guys, on a possession to possession basis, it makes all the sense in the world to just run the same play through the same guy and do things that way. But in the grand scheme of things, that's not always the best way to run your offense, especially in the playoffs. So you always kind of have to balance what is the best potential way to generate the most efficient shot on this individual possession versus how do we keep ourselves unpredictable and dynamic, but still generating efficient shots on every possession.
Yeah, the diversification point is a good one too. And it's something I know I've talked about before, but part of why, in addition to Trae being awesome at it, which is the number one reason why they do a lot of pick and roll, is that they didn't exactly have a bunch of great decision maker passers around him. Like for all John Collins' strengths, not exactly a strength of his at the four. Clint Capella is obviously a pure rim threat, doesn't really do anything with the ball in his hands. DeAndre Hunter, pretty weak in that category for a typical three. So like, I think that's one area where not having Collins, and I think maybe having a little bit more Kongwu this year, also adding more Jalen Johnson, who's a really good decision maker, like very much a more capable guy with the ball in his hands, maybe more bogey this year, all those things. Like, I do think there's a fine line, and it's something I scream about all the time. Like they need to still stay with Trae pick and roll, and they got away from it almost too much last year. But it's easier to get away with that if you have other guys who can make, even if it's the old Daniel Rue, 2 dribbles and a good decision, which they didn't really have those guys. Like they didn't really have those guys. I mean, they still don't have a ton of them. I mean, Sadiq Bey is not great at that. I think he's probably better than Collins at it. But having Jalen and again, maybe minimizing Capella, they already were doing this. I think it's going to be even more stark this year. Capella is going to be paired to Trae. I don't think you're going to see Capella on the court without Trae very often at all, if ever, honestly. And that's probably the way it should be. So anyway, long story short, I do think that they it's not as easy as Nate bad, Quinn good. And it's not just that. There's some personnel challenges, but I think that to wrap up the coaching conversation a little bit, I think that it's going to be more analogous with what you see with modern offense is kind of the broad way that I would say. The Hawks were very much like stuck in the mud. It's a trope to say it was, mid-range equals 80s basketball. It's not that simple, but like
mid-range bad.
Yeah, well, it kind of, but even then, I will say, I probably get accused of being that too cut and dry sometimes. I do think that especially Trae and Dejounte should take their range shots.
Yeah,
they should. Now, should they take fewer? Yes, I think so. But those two guys in particular, I think DeAndre Hunter could stand and not take mid-range shots, even though he shot very well in them last year, actually. But like your primary ball handlers who are good enough to get to that shot and actually put pressure on the defense, like Phoenix, you don't see people like me and you who are not huge mid-range guys yelling about Phoenix taking too many mid-rangers. You just don't see that. Like the infamous one was Chris Paul always. Like people always say, well, analytics didn't want those. No, analyst guys were like, hey, Chris Paul is like the exception. He can take those shots.
Yeah.
Devin Booker, Kevin Durant, shoot all the mid-rangers you want to. Trae Young, like, is really good in there. Dejounte Murray, that's probably literally his best skill, is taking mid-range shots and creating them. Now, how value is that skill? I don't know. But like, no one's saying Morey ball with this team. I'm not saying that. But I do think that there's a fine line to be walked there. And I think Quinn's already kind of acknowledged, like, it'll be more modern, I feel like.
Yeah. Well, and I think, I don't know, one thing that I've kind of noticed recently is just kind of this change in the way, like what quote unquote modern offense is. Like we're not in the era anymore where like the James Harden Rockets era, where you just give the ball to your best player and he kind of creates something out of isolation, and you just surround that guy with 3-and-D guys, like the 2018 LeBron model. I don't think we're in that NBA anymore. And I think the Hawks have maybe missed the trend a little bit with roster construction, where I think they've gone out and their goal for so long was to try to find guys who could maybe play that kind of system around Trae Young with a little bit more kind of ball handling and playmaking chops. But I think what it's about now in the NBA is surrounding great players, primary offensive players, with guys who can make quick decisions, guys who can, maybe make some plays off the dribble, be tertiary ball handlers, and just kind of be like kind of jack of all trade type guys in a free flowing offense where that kind of like, the Warriors 2 years ago, the Nuggets last year, like we're seeing, I think the Kings last year, I know they didn't go far in the playoffs, but best regular season offense. Like we're seeing the best offenses now are the offenses that just move from one thing into the next, because they have a lot of guys who can make plays and move the ball, put the ball on the deck, make good decisions, things like that. And like you said, that's not really the Hawks' strong suit. They have one guy who is elite at making decisions and handling the ball and creating advantages off the dribble. They have one guy who's okay at it. And then they have a bunch of guys who that's not really their forte. And so they're kind of left that I think contributes to that stagnation and that disjointedness we were talking about earlier. And that's where I think a coach like Quinn Snyder can make a big difference when you don't have a team that sort of intuitively does all of those ball and player movement sorts of things. I think he can really kind of instill that in this team, hopefully. But, the reality is that they don't have a team that's full of those sorts of guys who are going to move the ball really quickly, make a quick decision, put the ball on the deck, collapse the defense, and then make the next play, kick it out to a shooter who can keep the line moving. This is not really a keep the line moving offense. And I think the state of offense in the modern NBA, it's kind of a keep the line moving kind of league right now. So the Hawks, I wonder if they, in attempts to kind of get with the times, have actually fallen a little bit behind the times in recent years. And I think it's good to have a coach like Quinn Snyder to address that issue, because I think he's equipped to do that. But the roster doesn't necessarily line up with the way that I think Quinn would ideally want to run this offense.
All right, that is all with part one of myself and Ben Ladner. Please subscribe to the podcast anywhere you get your podcasts, places like Apple, Spotify. Ratings and reviews appreciated. Follow the show on Twitter at Locked On Hawks. Follow me on Twitter at BT Rowland. Stay tuned for part two, which should be in your feeds momentarily, if not already. And we'll see you all next time.